can start our Nishida seminar about basically Nishida and Hegel and a lot of other. So the first speaker is Professor CERDA. He's already in the right position to start. I can make a little bit close up. So if you want to introduce yourself.
Oh yeah, let's see here. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so I'll introduce myself and jump straight into it.
Yes,
okay.
Could be have.
So my name is Sova PK CERDA. At present, I'm a postdoc with a JSPS Kakenhi grant, working the Graduate School of Human and Environmental Studies at Kyoto University. And then, yes, as of April, I'll have the opportunity to be teaching at Kyoto University's Department of the Graduate Schools of Letters. And to begin, thank you very much, Enrico, for your organizing. And thank you, Steve, for not ending our friendship over our attempt to translate this brutal text. And today my aim is really an attempt to reflect on the issues that I had in mind as we were going through this process of translation.
Probably you could say that we translated this text.
Yeah.
So probably people, the audience doesn't know.
Oh, right. Yeah, of course, yes. Under the leadership of our good friend Enrico here. We've been undertaking this project to translate Nishida's absolute contradictory self-identity into several different languages, compiling them together with the glossary so that researchers can examine them in the language that is perhaps best suited for their own research, but also being able to compare across different translations to get a kind of more comprehensive view of the text. And so in a very real way, this presentation is kind of a product of that process. So the title is What is Absolute Contradictory Self-Identity? Nishida, Hegel, and Ontological Truth. So I guess a brief agenda of my discussion today. I'm going to begin with a bit of background, so some methodological considerations and anticipation of the problem that I'm going to be discussing and how I'm going to be approaching the text today. As you can see from the kind of breakdown and structure of the presentation, I'll be working through this essay and its significance by considering a fourfold distinction in truth, a distinction made on the basis of intelligibility. And not much of that will make sense at the present point, but hopefully once we get to the background, we'll have some anticipation of what it means to think of truth in this fourfold way. So probably a very good place to begin is really with this question, why Nishida and Hegel in the first place? And so for the abstract for the seminar as a whole gives some indication of one answer to this question. And that's basically that, Hegel is a clear and explicit interlocutor in this essay, Absolute Contradictory Self-Identity. So it makes sense then to think of these two in those terms when we are looking at this essay. But there's also this interesting challenge that Hegel also seems to be our interlocutor today. And consider, for instance, Derrida's remarkable statement, we'll never be finished with reading and rereading Hegel. And in a certain way, I do nothing other than attempt to explain myself on this point. And I think this is an interesting comparison to a remark that Nishida himself made. While my present thinking has learned much from Hegel and is closest, I believe, to Hegel, I have much I should like to say to Hegel. And so part of the project today is, at least in the background, is this problem, you might say, the Hegel problem, this issue that Hegel can be kind of like a repressed trauma where the more we try to forget him, the more frightening he reappears for us, right? And this poses a kind of practical problem for philosophy and philosophers. So how do we actually work through this happening? How do we work through what Hegel has done in his project? And in a sense, how do we work through this philosophical past? So in a very general way, I think it is possible to consider a division of labor in this process of working through history and philosophical past. And I don't have enough time today to go through the details of all of these different projects and the principles behind them. But just kind of a brief overview to help orient what I'm going to be doing today specifically is we can think of it in terms of these three kinds of questions. So I have the question, what happened? And I'll refer to this as contextual history. So this is the issue where we are looking at texts. We are trying to trace out different constellations of debates, understanding what concepts are being in response to what problems, who are the interlocutors that each thinker is specifically addressing. What did they say, right? It's what's going on here in this essay? And this is usually something that happens at the very beginning of receiving a thinker and their thought. The next, though, is what we might call philosophical history. And this goes from the question, what happened, what was being said, to, well, what does it mean, right? We can create a nice framework where we connect the dots, so to speak, between different ideas in a thinker's thought path. But there's a sense where we're not really doing philosophical work until we get to some conclusions or raise some questions about what all of this means, what's going on here, what's its purpose or what it's aiming for. And then finally, there's what I'll call the history of mind. So we might get some general sense, okay, so when Nishida says these things, he seems to mean this, but what's the evaluative consequences of that? Is this something that we should accept? Is he presenting a theory that creates a unique demand on us as thinkers to rethink an issue, to reassess our own presuppositions? Or is he leading us down a dead end, right? So we have this question then, it's three different questions. What was said, what happened, what was said happened mean? And then how do we assess that meaning? What is its purport? So today in particular, I'm going to be focusing on these two questions below. I apologize to Nishida scholars, but today I'm not going to be able to spend much time kind of contextualizing this essay in Nishida's own thought. I'm really just going to be diving into this essay on its own, and a lot of what I say today is going to be premised on things that he writes elsewhere, but I won't be making those connections explicit. I'm going to be focusing really on trying to figure out, okay, what does he mean when he is saying what he says? And we might be able to think of this philosophical history as a kind of translation. Of course, not just a linguistic translation, which is what we did. We translated this text into English, Steve and I, but really a translation of purport. So what does the philosopher mean when they say what they do? And then in the second, I'm going to be focusing then at the very end of the paper to get to this question in history of mind. So how do we assess its meaning? And just to kind of lay my own cards on the table, the way I understand this problem is in a kind of dialogical sense. And I think of this in terms that Stanley Rosen once spoke of. So he said that a dialogue is the articulation of a question into a family of questions. So by tracing out these different questions, the branches that they lead us down, we might find that certain branches do lead us into irresolvable aporia, right? And I think this is one of the interesting consequences, for example, of Kant's treatment of the antinomies of pure reason, right? So he lays out a certain set of questions and shows how, well, when we set the questions in these terms, they basically lead to an irresolvable conflict. And so we need to start asking a different kind of question. Of course, we don't have to follow Kant's exact way of setting up the problem, but I think that general issue of dialogue is one way of thinking this problem in the history of mind. We assess its meaning by following its questions and trying to articulate those questions further and trying to assess whether they are just taking us down a dead end or if they're actually helping us understand the deeper issues at play. So that's the kind of the terrain that we're going to be covering, mostly, like I said, in the philosophy of philosophical history, but then at the end, some remarks in the history of mind. So the way that this will be roughly broken down is assessing this text, absolute contradictory self-identity for LOFTS. And then at the very end, kind of setting in motion the dialogical process of how to assess its meaning. So taking this question of absolute contradictory self-identity and then bringing in attensive dialogue with Hegel. I don't make any promises today to try to resolve this conflict, but I think that by bringing them together, by asking the right sorts of questions, we can get to some kind of interesting problems for today. So the structure of the overall paper is going to be based on that fourfold division of truth that I had mentioned earlier. And so I think it's helpful to get some kind of anticipation of where we're going with that. My basic proposal is that we can understand absolute contradictory self-identity in terms of ontological truth. So to put it in that language of translation before, Nishida means ontological truth when he speaks of absolute contradictory self-identity. So again, to give some kind of anticipation of what that could all mean, let's start with something like propositional truth. So we say, my camera was made in Germany. Here I've got a picture of my camera here. And my camera was in fact made in Germany. So the fact that my camera was made in Germany corresponds nicely with this proposition, my camera was made in Germany. And so that proposition itself is thereby true. Now, this isn't the only way of thinking about propositional truth. And I think most recently, it was perhaps Heidegger who explored this next aspect of pre-propositional intelligibility, the idea that things have their sense and significance within particular situations at a time. So for example, this proposition, my camera was made in Germany, is really bizarre in the abstract. But if we can imagine, maybe somebody asked me, go into your room and collect all the things that you have that were made in Germany. And so I go and I pick up my camera and I bring it to him. And he says, well, why did you bring your camera? And then I would say, well, my camera was made in Germany. You told me to go find the things. And so it's in the context of this kind of game that we're playing here, go find the things made in Germany, that my camera appeared for me at my desk, something that would satisfy the conditions of the demand that was made on me, right? So I'm not having to think in my head, going around looking at everything in my room. Oh, this is made in Germany. This is made in China. This is made, right? I'm not categorizing it in this way, but rather the camera just appears to me at my desk as, okay, well, that's the sort of thing that I was being asked to look for. Right? And now again, if we make this reference point recently to Heidegger, he wanted to introduce this third dimension of truth, what he would call ontological truth. And this is a bit contentious because, of course, Heidegger himself would want it to move away from the language of truth or Wahrheit. But if we just take the point of what he was trying to get at there, he suggested that there is some kind of clearing that makes possible both A and B. And that perhaps there was a kind of failure in the history of Western metaphysics to actually think this clearing that makes possible A and B. So part of my suggestion today is that might have been a bit of an overreaction to the Western canon. Because I think Hegel also has a conception of ontological truth that we must contend with. And also then I think, of course, the main project of today is to try to show that, well, Nishida too has some conception of this clearing that makes possible pre-propositional intelligibility and propositional truth.
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
Because my English is not very good. Is clearing translation of something?
Maybe Lichtung.
Lichtung. Okay. Right.
Yep. And then finally, I think the interesting tensive point that I want to look at the very end is this question of the status of speculative truth. So I think that if in a fair assessment and reading of Hegel, we can see all three of those previous conceptions of truth, but Hegel wants to add this third idea of speculative truth, the idea thinking itself. And so at the end, I'm going to offer a very brief introduction of what that could mean and also the kind of tension it might create in Nishida's project. Hopefully a productive tension, I think, one that starts getting us to ask some interesting new questions. Okay. So then, yes, let's get into it and look at the issue of propositional truth. So in the absolute contradictory self-identity essay, Nishida does not thematize propositional truth per se, but I think this mode of intelligibility and its relationship to pre-propositional intelligibility can be explored by taking as a paradigm what Nishida calls scientific knowledge. So here we have a nice jumping off point. Nishida writes, actuality can be thought of as a place where something making and something made are contradictorily self-identical, where the present delimits itself, scientific knowledge must be established from such a standpoint. Okay, so the task in this section is to try to pin down these 3 points. So what is he talking about here about the actual standpoint? What does it mean for scientific knowledge to be established therefrom? And then what is the consequences of this for propositional truth? So first question here, what is the actual standpoint? So once more, we have a reference point here to kind of guide our considerations. Nishida writes, without the social, there is no transition from something made to something making. There is no poiesis. Our socio-historical standpoint would also condition the standpoint of our thinking. Knowing is also an event in the socio-historical world. So here, this is interesting because we kind of get a gloss of that issue of the actual standpoint or the actual world. We see here that what he means by this is a socio-historical standpoint or a socio-historical world. Next, he refers to knowing and thinking as a kind of event. And I think here it's important to kind of, we could say, exfoliate this concept a bit. So in, I think, this essay, Nishida is making a few different distinctions between kinds of events. So one type of event is what we might call mere happenings, where given sufficient conditions, a result takes place. And this is what Nishida would call the mechanical, something that is determined from the past to the present. The other kind would be what we might say is instrumental. So given an end, adequate means are undertaken. And this is what Nishida called the purposive, or something that is determined from the future. Now, the interesting thing here is that when he thinks of this knowing as an event in the socio-historical world, he thinks of it in terms of poiesis, or production. And one of his major claims in this essay is that poiesis, or production, is neither merely this mechanical determination nor a merely purposive determination. And I think as a first gloss of what's going on here, we could say that, okay, well, these historical conditions are necessary, but not sufficient conditions. Okay, if they were sufficient conditions, then it would just be mechanical, right? And so our other question here now is, okay, well, what makes it different from the instrumental, right? This determination from the future. So we need to kind of unpack that a little bit more. I think we can do so, though, by first taking on our second question. So what does it mean for scientific knowledge to be established from the actual standpoint? And so here then, let's take again this reference point. To grasp things as the individual self in active intuition or poiesis is to see things in historical space as the absolute present. It is to make clear the laws of things in the present and encompass the past and the future, and to grasp what I call the mode of production of the world. Therein lies the world of objective cognition. So there's a few things that we can glean from this idea and the kind of general direction of his thinking. So we see that knowledge production is an historical practice. And well, this is something that we're quite familiar with today. The natural sciences have a history, right? There's some kind of development, right? And we might think of this in terms of paradigm shifts, or we might think of it in terms of a greater continuity. But in some sense, we have an idea that there is some history to the natural sciences and this process of knowledge production. And I think part of the way that we can understand this, or the resources that Nishida gives to understand this, is this notion of historical space here. And this too is something that we're a bit more familiar with today. The idea that you can only experiment, or you can only propose a theory on the basis of some common assumptions. And so here I'm understanding this kind of assumptions, this kind of, this space in which a scientist actually lives and is a scientist, is the sort of historical space that Nishida is talking about. We'll try to unpack that a little bit more later, but for the moment, we have to think about, okay, so the idea of the socio-historical conditions is this idea of a kind of common assumptions. But the interesting point here, and again, this goes to that issue of insufficiency but necessity, is that the natural scientist aims beyond history in a certain sense, right? So if you think, for example, when Einstein proposed the special principle of relativity, he was trying to say something about how it is, right? He's not just saying, this is how we think it is right now, but this is, right, a principle for understanding the basic physical laws, right? So of course, Einstein was responding to a certain history, and he was responding on the basis of certain historical assumptions. But on the basis of that, he is some way making an appeal beyond those historical constraints. The next here, I think it's really interesting that we see that active intuition is appearing as a positive of poiesis. So we can kind of frame this as two sides of the same coin, is that, well, just as objective cognition is aiming beyond history, the historical conditions are necessary but insufficient to determine the production of objective cognition. Okay, so the way I kind of gloss or have in mind as a kind of a handle or foothold for active intuition is that, well, the active part is speaking to this insufficiency that we have encountered, but also intuition reminds us of the sort of necessity of those conditions, sort of responsiveness, a productive responsiveness to historical conditions. Okay, so with these terms laid out now, we can start to assess this issue of propositional truth and what it all means. So again, let's start with this reference point. Nishida writes, the actuality of active intuition is always the place of contradiction, and it's here that things are decided. The truth or falsehood of thought is also determined here. So then here we can start to make, again, to try to piece together the issues that we've been looking at so far. And we can say that, well, these novel proposals, like Einstein's special principle of relativity, or putative discoveries, are put forward on the basis of shared assumptions. But for an instance of knowledge production to actually count as objective cognition, it must be determined as true, right? It doesn't, if someone makes an interesting novel proposition and it gets lost in the archives of some journal somewhere, in a certain sense, the truth of that proposition has not been established. It's been lost to the archives in a certain sense. So it has to get out there, elicit a response. But then, given the novelty of the proposal, if it is indeed novel, the determination of its truth involves a corresponding process of production. And this is what we would know as scientific or experimental reproducibility, right? So if I conduct an amazing and interesting experiment with these great results, that experiment must be reproduced, right? Another process of reproduction and production that must be involved to actually decide the truth or falsity of the claims that that theory makes. So then, accordingly, determinations or acknowledgements of propositional truth are deeply embedded in these socio-historical practices. So if you take something like, and just to clarify an important point here, so physical laws, right, so the truth of the postulates depends on these historical assumptions and presuppositions, but it does not depend on which society is evaluating it, right? And so there's not going to be one community of scientists over here with their own history and another community of scientists over here with their own history, and they each reach different conclusions about this, the truth of the claims, right? The point is rather just that the intelligibility of the proposition is impossible independent of any socio-historical world and its practices. Okay? So it's not a kind of radical relativism in that sense. It's just saying that truth and falsehood wouldn't even be intelligible in propositions unless it was happening within certain historical practices. And again, I think this is an idea that we're a little more familiar with too, especially with the notion of speech acts, right? Where a speech act is a kind of deed taking place, and these are exchanged and are actually practices and actions themselves. Oops. So I think we've already kind of built a bridge now to start thinking about this issue of pre-propositional intelligibility, once we've introduced this idea of socio-historical practices. And so our question now then is, okay, so if we're saying that propositional truth depends for its intelligibility on these practices, our next question naturally is, okay, well, what are these practices themselves? What's going on there and how are we to understand them? And so I think just before, as propositional truth was, or the paradigm of propositional truth was taken as scientific knowledge, for Nishida, the paradigm of pre-propositional intelligibility is life. Reference point to introduce these issues. In the world that moves itself as the absolute contradictory self-identity of many in one, the embodied subject and the environment are thoroughly opposed. And this is the world that is thought to form itself in a contradictory way. That is, the world of life. So right here, we see Nishida introducing the two moments in his conception of this world of life. The embodied subject, or shitai, and the environment, and kankyo. So in this next section here, our main objective is to try to figure out, okay, what's going on with this embodied subject and the environment. Okay, so to help us start unpacking this issue of the embodied subject, then let's start with this new reference point. Nishida writes, the individual must be something that works, something that thoroughly delimits itself. To work is to thoroughly negate the other and to try to make the other the self, to make the self the world. However, on the other hand, it is the negation of the self by the self becoming an element of the world. So there's a lot of complex moving parts going on there. So I'd like to take a little time to try to tease them out in turn. So the first issue is what is going on in this self-delimiting self-formation. So the first point, I think, is really the jumping off point here. Well, all this talk of the self, we need to understand that this shitai is in some sense a self. In the most direct sense that it is a self is that it has an opposition with an other. And I think here there are some natural reverberations with Nishida's early thoughts and his confrontation with Fichte. The second point then here is that this sort of opposition with the other is occurring through something like assimilation. So we need to try to figure out, okay, so what does Nishida mean by this assimilation? And now third, we can see there's kind of two parts of this assimilation that Nishida wants to appeal to. So on the one hand, through assimilation, the self makes itself the world, but at the same time as making itself the world, it makes itself an element of the world through delimitation. And so to kind of give us a paraphrasing foothold on what this means, I suggest that we could understand this to say that, well, so I as an embodied subject or self, I make the world my world and make myself a member of a world that I thereby identify with. Okay, so it's not like I'm just inflating myself into some giant, cosmic entity, but rather for a world to be my world just means for me to identify with that world. Right? To identify with that world is not to say that I am thereby just this giant world thing, but rather it means to be a member of that world. And this is that sense in which we are both element and world. This idea of membership. And so if we were to kind of parse this idea of assimilation of, we might say that assimilation of is identification with. Yeah, Nishida has some kind of really interesting ways of now tackling this questions of assimilation. And the primary mode of that assimilation, or the mode of embodied subjectivity, is what he calls the desirous. I think this is important to think of it in terms of this sort of adjective or adverbial, right? So it's not that a subject somewhere, an enduring substance subject, has desires, but rather the subject is by way of desire. It is the mode of its being. And I think then this would point into the direction that, well, rather than having, for example, some fixed res cogitans, foundational starting points, it makes us think in the direction of a subject as a sustained activity. And I think maybe the most direct way to put that is to say it's something like, well, being a self is just being alive. So the way that we sustain life, the way that we continue our lives, is just what it is to be a self. And then, Nishida has an interesting gloss on this and what it means to be alive. So he writes, life is always unstable. And there's something called life as long as it is unstable. So that's kind of the issue that we want to address here. So if we want to understand this embodied subject, this shutai, we need to think of it not as some, res cogitans substance I subject thing, but rather it is this sustaining activity, self-sustaining activity that is desirous, and as desirous, intrinsically unstable. So then what is our embodied subject as desirous? So here then there's two more interrelated aspects of desirous subjectivity. And the first is consciousness. So Nishida writes, that we are desirous does not mean that we are mechanical or merely purposive. It must mean that the world is reflected in the self. It must mean that we use the world as a mediation for self-formation. So I think this is really helpful because it helps us, it maybe helps dissuade us from certain understandings of assimilation, right? And so we could think of kind of brute assimilation as a kind of digestion, right? Of actually consuming the other in a certain way, or in a political sense as a kind of subjugation of the other. But rather, I think instead what he has in mind is this dual process of reflecting the world into ourselves. In contemporary language, we have this phrase, bringing the world into view, reflecting the world into ourselves. But at the same time, desirously situating ourselves in that world, right? So we have some sense of the world in view, and we are also actively situating ourselves within that world. And so it's often helpful to try to figure out what this means through a comparison with our other animal friends. So to take this example, we could say something like a salmon assimilates oxygen from the water. And this would be an example of that kind of brute assimilation of digestion, or in this case, respiration. But the primary issue that I think Nishida has in mind here, when he talks about this reflective process as having a certain image of the world, means that the fish, again, is sort of desirously placing itself in its world, which we might call like the water for salmon. And so it's not that salmon have a kind of theoretically understanding of water and oxygen or anything like that, but they do have, I think, a certain kind of pre-propositional intelligibility, right? The water is something that they navigate in, and they understand how to navigate within it. They understand how to identify other members of their species, how to identify predators, prey, and so on. And all of this is taking place in this process of having this image of the world and situating themselves desirously within it. So now, if the first aspect of desirous subjectivity is consciousness, and we, to a certain degree, share this with our friends, the other animals, the second aspect is distinctive of human beings. And so here I use the terminology of self-estranging, which in this essay Nishida himself does not use, but I think it's a helpful foothold for unpacking what he means. And so yeah, again, to use another reference point as a foothold here. The environment is not something given, but something made. There we can truly say that the embodied subject breaks away from the environment. The world of biological life is still not the world of An and Fusdi. So again, the world of biological life is this life of the fish that we looked at here. Right? So for the fish, it just has this water for salmon. That's the world that it has. But I think the point that Nishida is making here is that what is inaccessible, what is intelligibly inaccessible in the fish's mode of pre-propositional intelligibility is this notion that water as something made, its world as something made. So in a way, the salmon does not have access to water per se. It does not have access to water as a kind of built or produced environment, but it is only water for salmon. That's the world that it lives in and that it's absorbed in, and that it is able to live its salmon life. And that's great for salmon, but Nishida's point is that that's not exactly how human beings reflect the world in themselves and situate themselves in that world. Instead, human beings, by contrast, are capable not only of seeing the world as the world, but also seeing the world as the world for human beings, right? An interesting point that Nishida is making here is that when we see the world as a world only for us, right, as a world, as something that we've made, merely just made, we are dissatisfied by it. And so he writes, our life is poisoned by something of our own making. Right? And today we have this kind of discourse of social construct, and we could say that when something appears to us as merely a social construct, we've already become detached from it, or in Nishida's language, we've already broken away from it, and somehow it's already lost its grip on us as reality, as the world. So coming to see something as simply and merely a social construct is this process of, well, that's just the world for us, or for that community, or for this group of people. But it is not actually the world as it is. So then, just as a brief recap of our survey of this embodied subject as desirous, we noted that, okay, well, first and foremost, to be an embodied subject is to be self-delimiting and self-forming, this process of identification through assimilation. And so to try to unpack this issue of assimilation, we looked at the problem of our being desirous. And here, Nishida proposed that there's at least these two aspects to being desirous: the conscious, reflecting the world into ourselves, this mode of assimilation, and desirously situating ourselves in the world, identification. But at the same time, what is, he believes, unique to the human way of this self-delimiting self-formation, the unique way that human beings are desirous, is this unique capacity for self-estrangement, the special dissatisfaction that human beings might have toward the world as so reflected into ourselves. And so we can reflect the world into ourselves as something merely produced, something that no longer should have a necessary grip on us as the world. So now we have the other side then. If the Shutai, the embodied subject, was this problem of human desirous being, the way that subjectivity sustains itself, the other half of the issue then is this question of the environment, the world, this thing that we are engaging with and potentially dissatisfied with. And so then the first is one that is the point that we've kind of explored so far, this idea of its being made, this idea that it is socio-historical. And I think another aspect of this madeness of the human world is that the world is a kind of socio-historical achievement, right? So fish, of course, in certain ways are going to be modifying their environment in a comprehensive and complex ecosystem. But it's hard to say that this is something that fish banded together to achieve, right? There's a kind of a reciprocal connection within ecosystems, but human beings are able to actually see the way that they establish and create their environment as something that they have done, right? For better or worse, right? It could have been a real failure of doing, or it could be something that is maybe a great civilizational accomplishment. Right? The second point here, that the environment is normative, I wanted to emphasize because it's really easy to overlook in this dense treatment in the text. And the key point here is that Nishida's claim that we are historically corporeal. Okay, so the way that subjects are bodies in an environment. And so first he says that, well, human beings have our bodies in things. Second point he makes is that this having of a body in things is possessing, right? And this again is going to be something that's going to be different for salmon. Salmon also will have their bodies in things, but salmon do not possess their body in things. And the difference here is that possession requires recognition by what Nishida calls the objective world, or by sovereignty. Right? So having a body in things is a form of possessing, and possessing in this case requires a normative recognition from an authority or sovereignty. And this Nishida calls the legal world. So this way that we have our own bodies is deeply connected to these issues of normativity for him. And well, another way to kind of simply make the point is that, well, human beings are not simply extended bodies in space. Rather, we are these ascriptions, these statuses in a historical space. Authoritative norms and scientific knowledge is one example of this. So earlier, we mentioned the way that a scientific discovery or novel discovery, or a scientific theory or novel discovery takes place on the basis of certain socio-historical assumptions. And the reason that this happens is because the foothold for those novelties, the foothold for these rethinking of scientific principles is happening through this process of recognizing certain norms as authoritative. But of course, there's so many more close at hand examples of this. For example, to get here, I took a train from Osaka to Nagoya. And in my mind, I had to have some basic idea, some basic grasp of the norms that I was navigating, right? I had to know that in order to board the train, I have to buy a ticket, right? If I don't buy a ticket, someone's going to get very angry with me, right? There's a legal nexus in which my body is moving through space, right? And I have to have a very firm grasp on how all that works. But I also have to have kind of maybe a broader sense of legality and normativity. I have to know simply that taking a train is a vehicle for getting one place to another, right? If I don't know what trains are for, if I don't really know the purpose or the point of trains, then I'm going to have some real problems, right? And all of that is so kind of in the background that we really even need to reflect on it, which I think is why we can think of this as a case of prepropositional intelligibility, right? So again, we have to kind of dissuade ourselves of this idea that, we're kind of walking around categorizing things, with these categorical judgments, but rather that just is the way that we are moving about space. This acknowledgement, even if implicit, even if deeply implicit, of the norms. So now this last 2 points, this idea that the environment has this to be accomplished character. What Nishida says is that the environment is given as a task. And this is tied into what he also, this other very interesting characterization of the environment as demonic. Somehow the environment as made normative is given as a task that is also in some way demonic. It's both oppressive and tempting. So I think that is worth exploring just a little bit here. So what does it mean for the environment to have this sort of demonic quality? And so I think the first part, if we look at this tempting issue, what does Nishida mean when he says that the environment is tempting? And well, we have to go back to this basic idea that, the way that subjectivity is sustained is in this desirous mode. So for human beings, pre-propositional intelligibility is desirous in the specific sense that our activities are socio-historical and normative. Okay, so when I go to get on the train, I am desiring certain things to happen. I have expectations, you might say. If I bought the ticket for the train, got on the train conductor comes up to me, asks for my ticket, sees my ticket, shreds it up and says, get off the train. He's going to violate certain basic expectations that I have. My desire, my understanding and expectations of what it means to ride on a train have been severely flouted, right? And again, this is not an issue of having reflected on all of this beforehand, but it's sort of just built into the way that things show up for us, right? So there's this tempting allure that things should go as we expect, right? This is this idea of tempting, that we have these expectations, these really deeply rooted expectations for how things ought to go, how things ought to function. And we usually don't realize them until they are violated, until suddenly we realize that we had expected this thing all along and we are frustrated. The other half of the story then is this quality of its being oppressive that Nishida points to. And so, as we've been emphasizing throughout the authorities that are intrinsic to norms are historical achievements, but precisely because they're products, these sources of normativity can become dissatisfying in a productive way, right? So these sources of normativity, as being capable of being seen as mere social constructs or as mere products, we can be disillusioned by this idea that something is set in stone, right? We do not see these norms as eternal commandments, but we see them as contested and contestable. So then, yes, there's a very brief overview of what we've looked at so far. Then this issue of pre-propositional intelligibility, that we've already seen that one of the ways that things show up for us as intelligible just by navigating our environment is deeply embedded within socio-historical practices and the normativity that they entail. Let's see. But now then we have that last question that we wanted to try to parse. This question of, okay, so how do these things show up as intelligible in the first place? What does it mean for meaning to be open to us, accessible to us? So to clarify Nishida's conception of ontological truth, and thereby, I believe, the meaning of absolute contradictory self-identity, we must more closely examine the central concepts that we've been dealing with so far: world, environmentality, and subjectivity. So then, yes, again, for this helpful reference point, intuition itself is a self-contradiction. As long as the world lives, that is, as long as it is creative and productive, it cannot but fall into self-contradiction. So giving the real centrality of life and pre-propositional intelligibility, I think it's remarkable that Nishida uses life to speak of the world. So if the world is alive, it's both creative and productive, and then it seems to share crucial features of subjectivity. But the world also seems to be characterized as an environment in Nishida's text. And so we have this kind of interesting, at least initially, what might strike us as an ambiguity. On the one hand, Nishida is speaking of the world in the terms that he uses to characterize subjectivity. On the other hand, he speaks of the world in the terms that are more adequate for the environment. So we want to question here. So what is going on with these concepts? How are they supposed to fit together? And what is the point of fitting them together in that way? So taking hold of this issue of self-contradiction, now let's try to understand the world's environmentality and subjectivity. And I think one approach is the one that I think Marcus Gabriel has put on the table. And I think thinking through his basic framework is a helpful way to kind of pose the opposite view of what probably Nishida does not have in mind. And with that contrast, we can get a firmer grasp on what Nishida actually is after. So Marcus Gabriel has famously made the argument that the world does not exist. Right? So in his conception of things, his idea is that there are going to be, if we were to translate it into the issues that Nishida is dealing with, we'd say that, well, there are subjects, and then subjects are in an environment, right? They're circumscribed within an environment. And this environment itself can be a subject relative to another environment. And so you have these kind of circling circumscriptions where a subject is relative to an environment is relative to a subject, right? Until Gabriel thinks we reach this problem of the world. So the world would be this maximally circumscribing kind of outer thing, right? And the problem, though, is that, well, if you have this maximally circumscribing thing, it would seem to be just an environment. And now Nietzsche is claiming that, no, this world also has this kind of quality to it. And so we seem to be stuck with this kind of contradiction. So in one sense, the world is a subject, that is in the sense that it is creative and productive. But in the very same sense, the world is not a subject because a subject is circumscribed in an environment, but there is no broader environment that could circumscribe the world. Right? If there was something that could circumscribe the world as a subject, then that would be the world. And so you have this kind of infinite regress, and you never actually get to, into any kind of final resting point. One resolution to this, and I don't think this is the one that Gabriel himself makes, but one possibility would be to entertain something like a dialectic approach, right? So it is possible to think that that a contradiction is true, that there are some contradictions that are true. So we might think that, well, Nishida is entertaining something like that, and that's what he means by self-contradiction. We can say both the world is a subject and the world is not a subject. But I'm going to propose that this is what Nishida would call abstract logic. So to unpack this a little bit, I've introduced the schema. So here we see those kind of in circles, those circumscribing centers, right, that would be proposed on a schema like Marcus Gabriel's. So at the very center here, we are positing a subject that is not an environment. So me, for example, and I, a self. And now circumscribing that is going to be something that could be both an environment to me, but a subject to something else. So for example, a household, right? To just kind of clarify this example a little bit, put it kind of more accessible terms. So I'm married, I share a household with my wife, and the household has its own sort of environmentality to us. So me, I willingly submit my paycheck to the household bank account, right? And the environment frames the way that I can kind of think economically. I can't just spend all the money on my paycheck, right? In a certain way, I'm committed to this environment, or the environment makes demands on me as the household. And so I happily submit my paycheck to the environment, the household, right? And then the environment, this household can also act as a subject. And so for example, if we need to go buy some new furniture or some appliances, the household has certain agency. So the money from our household can be used to make these purchases for the household. So on the one hand, it is circumscribing me as an environment. It's that to which I submit my paycheck. But on the other hand, it can function as a subject in a broader economic world where it has agency to use money and purchase things for our household. Now, of course, it's not some kind of floating mind that exists independently of me and my wife. The issue is just that my wife and I would appeal to the household when we're discussing what's best for our economic decisions, right? So we think about what kind of life do we want to live? What kind of household do we want to have? And it's by appeal to these things that we will make decisions about the household. And of course, someone is going to be representing the household when we make these payments. The household itself is not going to walk into a store and buy furniture, but one of us is going to act as a representative of the household with a credit card to buy the certain thing, right? And so this thing can kind of expand and expand. We could think that, well, our household is circumscribed by a neighborhood association. This neighborhood association, in Japan, it doesn't have much political power, but we could think in certain senses, it makes demands on our household. But at the same time, as a subject, it is responsive to a municipality, which does have tax accumulating powers. So it makes some more concrete demands on the economic unit of our household and neighborhood. But then the municipality itself is going to be a subject in response to an even greater environment, the prefecture, and so on and so forth. And so, as I mentioned before, if we think of things in these terms, the terms set by Marcus Gabriel, eventually we would hit this kind of extreme limit, and we might have to posit some kind of contradictory environment, not subject-subject, this world of absolute contradictory self-identity. Now, the reason I want to identify this as abstract logic is by consideration of the ways that Nishida talks about the abstract. On the one hand, he'll say that the abstract is static. Then again, this language of life comes out. Abstract logic is a kind of dying. So what does he mean by using this kind of dramatic terms of dying? So the first point here to make is that our very starting point here, this first posit of me as a non-environmental subject, I am fixing myself as a certain point. I am fixing myself as a subject. And as we said before, this is the very issue that Nishida is trying to deny, right? The subject is not a fixed point, but instead it is a self-sustaining activity. And this self-sustaining activity means that in a certain way, subjects can fail to be subjects in the way that living things can fail to be alive. They can be dead. So in this case, Nishida has this interesting claim where we aren't just biologically dying, but something is robbing us of our soul. So we are dying while being kept alive. Right? So in this sense, this would be that kind of, if we were to try to fix ourselves as a static and subject that does not need to sustain itself actively, this would be a sense of poisoning it, right? Poisoning it with what we have made. And the same goes then for these other posits as well. So even though this model allows us to understand, say, a household as an environment relative to me and a subject relative to neighborhood association, those relationalities are also fixed. They're set as an environment to me or a subject relative to the neighborhood association. But I think that when we look at Nishida's his theory here, the household itself is going to have this instability that he spoke of as life. There's a possibility that the household could fail. I mean, we know divorce is possible. There is a sense in which the household cannot sustain itself as living anymore, and it can dissolve. And then finally, we get to this last posit of the world of absolute contradictory self-identity. And this too is just another instance of fixing by positing this possibility of having a truthful contradiction, fixing something as both subject and not subject. And so while it might be an innovative approach worth exploring, I think it will miss the basic issue that Nishida is talking about when he is contrasting abstract logic with what he would call concrete logic, which is what we need to transition to next. So I think when we start to deal with Nishida's approach to concrete logic, again, Nishida himself is not treating Spinoza in this text itself, but I think looking at Spinoza's ethics offers us a helpful historical reference point for working through what's at issue here. And so these two propositions I find particularly important for Nishida's understanding of concrete logic that we're going to move to next. So then the first proposition from Spinoza's ethics, no thing can be destroyed except by an external cause. And the second proposition, every single thing endeavors as far as it lies in itself to preserve its own being. So now, where Spinoza attributes destruction to externality, I think Nishida interestingly links destruction and preservation in his principle of from the made to the making. So in some sense that we need to try to explore further, this destruction, this possibility of destruction is not merely an external cause, but somehow it's internal to this endeavor to preserve its own being. So we need to try to figure out what's going on there. And next then here, I think this point I wanted to raise again here as a way of understanding this inherently unstable point. So life is inherently unstable. because of this emphasis that Nishida wants to make on a conceptual connection between self-preservation and self-destruction. So in some way, self-destruction can't be a mere externality to self-preservation. I think this next quote here, I wanted to introduce that because it helps us now turn back around and see what was happening in the abstract logical approach. So Nishida writes, in the absolutely contradictory self-identical present, what moves us as something made must be something that approaches us in abstract logic as the because it was so, so it must be. From the standpoint of abstract logic, we think of the world as something determined. So that fixing that I was talking about when we posit, fixing of abstract logic is a kind of destructive attempt at self-preservation. So in some way, abstract logic actually does enact this issue that Nishida is talking about. It actually enacts the conceptual connection between self-preservation and self-destruction. But the problem is that it doesn't actually account for what it is doing here. So it doesn't actually account for the connection that it enacts. It just accomplishes the self-destruction in attempting to preserve itself by this fixing of these different posits. So here I offer an alternative schema for what Nishida calls concrete logic. So here Nishida says that concrete logic is the world thoroughly forming itself in a contradictory self-identity. And here I'm understanding this to mean that, well, a concrete logic is just a logic of self-transformation. And this ties into the issue of what Nishida calls the eternal now. In other words, the eternal, this self-identity, is in some way present in transformation or contradictory. So let's try to unpack that a little bit more here. So in the schema, we have these little circles here, and I understand each of these circles to represent the loci of instability. So we can think of each of these circles as a kind of center of self-transforming and thereby unstable life. Now, as you can see, the major distinction in this schema with the one from abstract logic is that this is not an additive circumscribing, right? We don't have more and more circles being added to each other until we have to reach some posit of a final world at the very end of a series. But rather, this embedding process that the abstract logic tries to grasp is instead divisional. So we could say that, well, the world is implied in every part, just as the denominator of a fraction implies the whole. And so as we see here, for example, if we were to kind of take this in mathematical terms, abstract logic is sort of looking at this additively, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all so on into infinity. But concrete logic, this unity there is always preserving itself within each of the divisions. So the next part of the schema here is we have this backwards arrow. And what I mean by this is to try to make or demonstrate or kind of indicate visually what it would mean to have a conceptual connection between those 2 points below here. So on the one hand, the relationality between loci, and then the self-preservation and self-destruction. So somehow that relationality is conceptually connected to this second way of the inherent self-destruction within self-preservation and the sort of self-preservation that is involved in destruction. So then, yeah, it was that issue of the self-preservation and self-destruction that was being missed in abstract logic's own enactment of it. So if we consider this quote here, Nishida writes, the embodied subject lives by submerging itself in the environment, and the environment becomes the environment by self-negating subjectification. So yeah, this is a very dense statement, needs a little bit to unpack. So again, to kind of draw on the resources that we've developed so far, we know, again, that a novel theory engages with socio-historical practices. Okay, so we were to establish that so far. And now we take that example of Einstein. So in a certain way, Einstein has determined himself by submitting his proposal to a community of scientists. Now, the interesting thing that happens here is that, well, by submitting this proposal, by determining himself within a specific community, he is, of course, opening himself up to critique. As we said, the only way to determine the truth of a novel theory is through reproduction, experimental reproduction. But the interesting thing is if this theory is accepted, Einstein has changed the rules in a significant way of what it means to do theoretical physics. And by changing the rules of what it means to be doing theoretical physics, he's also changing what it means to be himself as a theoretical physician, right? So by actually changing this environment, by changing this community in which he is operating, he is also changing what it means for himself to be a member within that community. And this then is self-transformation. So this is how that self-determination, determining himself within a community, is then also, ideally, if it's productive, if it's poetical, going to result in a self-transformation. So then the link here is that, I think the important point in this link here is that, well, the subject is going to fail internally without determining oneself as a member, right? So you can't be a scientist if you're not doing the work, right? You can't you can't consider yourself to be engaged in an academic community if you're not actually there putting yourself at stake. But the same goes for the environment. The environment fails internally without determining itself as a self-transforming subject. So in the case of Einstein, he was fortunate enough to find a community of sciences that were receptive to his ideas and is exchanged. And there's many other interesting cases in the history of science where this was not the case. There was, for example, the scientist Meyer, who had proposed this idea of aerobiology. And when he first made his proposal, the medical and biological community was incredibly resistant to thinking that it was possible that microorganisms could be traveling around in the air, even though this was compelling, or it should have been a compelling discovery in theory. But now his ideas are now accepted. So although it took a long time, that environment, that community was able to transform itself as a subject. So then, to bring this back to those issues in Spinoza and to kind of, put a sharper point on the question of ontological truth. So what now then is this openness to meaning that makes possible propositional truth and pre-propositional intelligibility? And so as I suggested before, Nishida is doing, we can understand Nishida in a certain way to be modifying these propositions from Spinoza. So the first proposition is that every single thing endeavors as far as it lies in itself to preserve its own being. Now we saw that this interesting interrelation between self-preservation and self-destruction, we can now see this as tied to that problem of dissatisfaction or self-estrangement. And I think the key point here is to note that this self-estrangement is a self-estrangement. It is something internal. So life is sustained as life just to the extent that it's not complete, right? This incompleteness, this ability to be dissatisfied with a proposed completeness is what accounts for what Nishida here calls in this quote, being beyond itself. So he says, the world is an absolute contradictory self-identity, has its self-identity in something that is beyond itself. And so to return to some previous language that we had used earlier. So the mechanical will fix self-identity from the past. The instrumental is going to fix self-identity from the future. But in this productive world, a self-identity is like a target that moves to the extent that it is aimed at, to borrow a metaphor from Terry Pinkard. So there's this process where it's aiming beyond itself is actually what sustains itself. Now then the second proposition from Spinoza, no thing can be destroyed except by an external cause. So here then I think this quote is helpful for understanding how Nishida would be responding to this proposition. So he writes that the self-identity of the world must be included as a moment in the ideational formation of history. The way I understand this is that, well, the openness of meaning that we're trying to examine here, this openness to intelligibility or the possibility of intelligibility, is an opening of externality from within. But again, this is that dissatisfaction of self-estrangement. And how that is possible for human beings in particular, is where those issues of normativity come back into play. this question of meaning, this question of intelligibility is also, and at the same time, an issue of authority, normative authority. Now, the point that Nishida would be making here is that, well, authority is only operative as authority, and that's opposed to sheer force or power to the extent that authority is at stake. Right? So it has to be open to contestation. Something only makes sense if it is also, and at the same time, open to correction, open to being reformulated. So I think that in the above way, this absolute contradictory self-identity is the concrete logic of self-transformation. And as concrete, it's that in terms of which intelligibility, whether propositional or pre-propositional, is open. So then finally, let's get to the conclusions and the final consideration of truth. So just to summarize very quickly, what we are to establish so far is that in pre-propositional truth, Nishida had taken scientific knowledge as paradigm. And we saw that in order for a proposition to be intelligible, it must be part of some socio-historical practice. Then in order to understand these socio-historical practices, we moved to pre-propositional intelligibility, and there we took life as a paradigm. We saw that these socio-historical practices are implicated, or what's implicated in those is the unique ways that human beings are conscious as desire. That is, the capacity that they have to be self-estranged from the very world that they have produced. Finally, then, this notion of ontological truth, this absolute contradictory self-identity, is that, well, this is a kind of absolute life. So typically, when we followed that abstract conception, we think that, well, living things live in environments, and maybe we can think of those environments themselves as subjects that are circumscribed by a broader environment. But the point that Nishida is making is that, well, this intelligibility itself is an absolute life in the sense that it is able to produce its own externality from within. Again, we have this image, this schema of kind of a cell dividing within itself, this kind of infinite production within itself, and not an issue of further and further realms of circumscription. Now, I think that on these three issues here, and I can't defend this in any way today, but I think that on a fair reading of Hegel, we could say that he would agree with most of these points so far. But the one place that I think would be sticking, and the one place that I think we can start to open up an interesting dialogue is with this fourth conception of truth that Hegel introduces, what he says, the idea thinking itself. So what in the world does Hegel mean to add by that? So in context, the claim comes here in the Encyclopedia Logic. He writes, the idea as the unity of the subjective and the objective idea is the concept of the idea. This unity is accordingly the absolute and entire truth, the idea thinking itself. And here indeed as thinking, as the logical idea. And of course, this means nothing on its own, but I think Hegel offers a helpful way of explaining what he means by this in the following passage. The absolute idea is comparable to the old man who says the same religious sentence as the child does. But for the old man, they have the meaning of his entire life. Even if the child understands the religious content, what validity that content has for him is still of the sort that lies outside his entire life. So I think here then the sort of Hegelian rejoinder to issues that we've been looking at so far would be that Nishida, in this essay, Absolute Contradictory Self-Identity, is not simply a very complicated, dense, maybe convoluted, sometimes distracted writer in need of an editor, but rather the difficulty of this paper and kind of the infamous difficulty of Nishida himself is the symptom of a certain kind of failure. And that's a failure to make philosophy as an explicit problem. So that's what I understand here when Hegel talks about the idea thinking itself as thinking, as the logical idea. This here is Hegel's account of philosophy itself. So what is philosophy doing? Making philosophy a problem. Now, I think this point here, I'm actually developing a point made by Nishitani Keiji's own critique of Nishida. Nishitani's point was that, well, Nishida simply philosophized, right? But he never attempted a philosophy of philosophy. So to kind of contextualize that rejoinder in the context of this essay, we could say, what does it mean to establish absolute contradictory self-identity as ontological truth for thinking? What are we doing here? Why is it important for Nishida to propose this conception? I think we get some hint at the kind of unique and odd way that Nishida writes and his approach to philosophical issues in general, and one that's actually quite pervasive today, one that in a certain sense, maybe contemporary journal articles are better structured than Nishida's essays, but I think there's a very deep similarity between the way Nishida approached problems and the way that we as philosophers approach problems. And I think the source of the issue comes in a revealing statement here in Absolute Contradictory Self-Identity when Nishida writes, after Kant, I believe, Lutze returned to the standpoint of ontology and thought about cognitive action. However, Lutze's ontology was not, as I say, socio-historical. And so here, of course, Nishida is critiquing Lutze's ontology for not having sufficient reflection on socio-historical conditions. But I think one of the things that he is granting Lutze here is this rejection of a unified method. So Lutze in his Metaphysics famously claimed that, Hegel's attempt is this kind of false speculative luster that surrounds Hegel's method. So for Lutze, the issue is this kind of articulation of a world view. And this articulation is something that has to happen piecemeal. And so while it might work out in a coherent way, it should be coherent, it's not going to be some kind of system building. So for Lutze, those days of system building had failed. And part of that failure is tied to the kind of speculative luster that he says that surrounds Hegel's method. So we can think then that Nishida is now thinking in this tradition after Hegel, after the putative failure of system and grand system building. But I think a more positive spin on this would be to say that the account of philosophy that Hegel would be demanding is actually internal to the philosophizing. So it's not a separate thing that you have to do, but it's actually there already in the discussion. So I think then this shift away from the speculative truth of thought thinking itself, so to speak, I might explain the following remark. So Nishida says, now therefore it must be absolute objectivism as opposed to something like mentalism or mysticism. So then the issue for Nishida is the world, thinking the world, and not thinking, not making philosophy a problem. Now, I think that there is something compelling here in the rejection of a unified method. Perhaps the complexity of the issues today cannot be responded to with a unified method. There's not going to be any kind of absolute transparency of thinking to itself that Hegel had thought was possible at his time. So perhaps we do need a diversity of approaches, or at least the room to test such approaches. Yet the question still remains, though, well, what is Nishida doing in this essay in particular? Granting that we need a diversity of approaches doesn't mean that whatever Nishida is doing makes sense. We still have this question, what is Nishida doing here in this particular situation? And so then, yes, this would be Hegel himself formulating his own rejoinder. So in general, this process is knowing in it, in one activity, the opposition, one-sidedness of subjectivity together with the one-sidedness of objectivity dissipated in itself. And this correspondence of is and ought, meanwhile, is not a frozen and inert correspondence. For the good, the final purpose of the world is only in that it produces itself again and again. So I introduced these quotes to show that, again, I think Hegel would be quite sympathetic to what Nishida is doing here. And especially sympathetic to this idea that the world is productive, self-productive. But Nishida's insistence on absolute objectivism, which seems to completely reject reflection on philosophical thinking itself, this, I believe, from Hegel's perspective, would be an overreaction. So then to return to our questions, I've spent a lot of time today looking at this question in philosophical history. What does Nishida mean when he says absolute contradictory self-identity? And it was only at this final point that we could try to think and assess what it means in this dialogical approach, taking a question and articulate it into a family of questions. I think Hegel and Nishida would both agree that philosophy is socio-historical. And I think Nishida has a very interesting point that we do need to reassess the speculative method. And maybe there can be no unified and single method for philosophy. But I think Hegel here also has an important point that any turn away from thinking itself, maybe doubting the possibility for something like pure thinking at all, thinking that it has no role at all to play, is equally infeasible, I think. It also should raise some questions then for this problem of absolute objectivism. Yes, thank you very much. I apologize. This is a very dense text, and I'm not sure if I made it any less dense, but I hope that I've helped us, tease out all these different issues and lay the foundation for what I think would be an interesting dialogue between these two incredible thinkers. So thank you very much for your patience.
Next discussion. Questions, or should we listen first Steve's presentation? No, it's better. Okay, so can you?
Oh yeah, stop here.
So also the people join online. If you want to put a question or make a comment, simply switch your microphone on and you can enter in the discussion. And of course, also in this room, we start. And so,
thank you. It was quite a marathon, a good one. And I feel a bit guilty because I mean there are many things, but I'm still maybe I'm digesting many things. So I'm sorry that I'm just breaking the ice with maybe a somewhat superficial observation. But like as he's using demonic.
Yeah.
So that's a word I thought it before in Nishida. And it rang a bell because I mean, like you of course you're exploring his connections to Hegel.
Yep.
But like here it's a keyword because it's like it also kind of testifies another connection to a giant of German thought like Goethe.
Yes.
It's not the thinking, but the way you introduce it, it seemed like when you talk about temptation, I would love to check this specific instance because of course I mean we make the assumption that it is, but in some cases it's quite evident, and so many of the things that are weaved in this huge problem. We're talking about contradictions. We're talking about subjects and the world, or kankyo, an environment. We're talking about the issue of creation, self-affirmation and self-negation. All these things are thematized by Goethe, in the conversations, and the Wahrheit, this autobiography, and he started discussing these self-contradictory identity with the world, that is self-denial, that is, and he does through demonic. So the idea of the demonic as a kind of like something that only manifests in contradictions, which again is like, of course, it's not the same contradiction as Hegel. And for me, I mean, in a way, I feel that it's a kind of like the kind of understanding of contradiction and creativity doesn't fall in the kind of like logical stasis, or like doesn't fall into pure speculation, because I mean, it's a very much concrete, it's an embodied form of restlessness that Goethe is describing, but then, of course, it's an interesting genealogy that goes Nietzsche to Zweig, for instance. And Nishida was kind of aware of that. I mean, as far as I know, it was that idea was surprisingly widely circulating in say between Meiji and Taisho.
Yeah.
So Nishida is not alone quoting that. It's a reference that it could be explored again in the first level, like when you're dealing with the actual circulation of ideas. But it could also, and more interesting, maybe it could be part of these deeper, quest for meaning. Went through. Because I mean, the kind of contradiction of self and word, it's not something that I feel as need for self-creation, as a need for self-transcendence of the self. So for Goethe, it's really the basic issue of a creative life in which I am denying myself and the environment at the same time through this absolute that I feel, but only through negation. And it's something, again, kind of close enough to some Asian idea.
That's great. Yeah. Actually, let me see if I can share my screen here really quick. There's I'm really glad that you brought up Goethe, because this here.
You say tempting and what is the
Tempting and oppressive.
And that's and it's really how he's describing these two things.
Yeah.
It's
actually
it's connected to desire, but it's also like it's a sense of restlessness. Like it's to be alive is to be unstable.
That's right.
That's right. I don't know if one could find that in Hegel, but it's for sure like on a biographic level.
Yeah.
It's very well expressed in Goethe, and Nishida was absolutely acquainted.
Yeah, this schema here and the contrast, the mathematical contrast between abstract logic and concrete logic. Yeah, this actually is my hidden source is Goethe.
Okay.
So this point here is
who's another physicist?
Yes,
Goethe
was hidden. Yes, exactly. There's issues of Spinoza here. Actually, it's I have Goethe in mind there as well. I'm glad that you brought that up.
Makes sense. So you were.
So he's definitely there. And I think even with Hegel at the time that he was developing the phenomenology. At this point too, he was in deep conversation with Goethe as well. And I think that, I think maybe if, as I go back here to the very beginning. Here we go. So if we have these three questions, contextual history, philosophical history, history of mind. So I think there's some very interesting work to do there in the first question that I neglected today is, looking at Nishida's reception of Goethe, looking at Hegel's reception in response to Goethe. And I think that too will then lead to different paths in these philosophical history and history of mind issues too. So I absolutely agree with you that Hegel is not, even if Derrida is right to say that we have to keep reading Hegel, we shouldn't just be reading Hegel.
Well, he was reading many other people.
Yeah.
So can you show me one of the last slides where you quoted Hegel saying that this one, the world much more. For example, this. They are really a question.
Yeah.
So, for example, Hegel says the idea is the unit of the subjective and the objective. Idea is the concept of the idea, and so on. These unities are only the absolute and entire truth. The idea, thinking itself, and here, indeed, thinking as the logical idea.
Yeah.
So probably, as far as I understand Nishida, the critic, one possible critic Nishida to Hegel, is that when Hegel speaks of this kind of logical idea, that is the idea of the unity of the subject and object, is still a being. So for Nishida, the absolute nothingness is not a being, is not an idea. So in this book, translated that you quoted at the beginning, the Hegel's dialectic is seen from my own perspective.
Yes.
One of the critics is that Nishida goes to Hegel. It's that Hegel remains ontological because the idea finally is a kind of being. But what Nishida wants to say is that the world of absolute contradictory self-identity is absolute nothing. In this sense, is unstable. Is impermanent in this sense. So
very good. Yeah, I think that's exactly one way of framing the issue in the unified method. So in the Encyclopedia Logic, as he develops what it actually means for the idea thinking itself, he moves from this absolute idea to absolute method. Right? So the truth of the absolute idea is the absolute method. So there is a unified method to speculative thinking. And I think you're exactly right. So if we think of the idea as being, maybe what Nishida means is that this kind of cognitive grasp, a unified cognitive grasp of the idea as being, he might be rejecting this, right? And this would then mean methodologically that we can't just follow this one unified method, but it would be something like LOFTS' proposal, that there would be a kind of plurality of methodologies, a kind of piecemeal approach to different issues, different situations. And I think those would be like kind of direct ramifications of rejecting this idea of being versus absolute, at least in the logical context, right? At least in this framework, right?
Yes. Therefore, I wanted to ask you, but partially you have already answered. For example, because Nishida is not thinking to an absolute idea, but to absolute nothingness as the how can I say, the place in which philosophy or thought is thinking. But there is absolutely no grounding in Nishida, in particular in this period, in the last final period. And therefore, every instant, every moment is self-determination of eternal now. So no mechanism, no theology, but everything starts in every moment and finish in every moment. Everything comes to life and dies at the same moment. Therefore, identity, self-identity is absolutely contradictory. So I wonder if you can find something similar in Hegel.
The interesting thing is, so when Hegel talks about the present that constantly returns to itself, is thinking of it in terms of nature and the repetitive cycles of nature. And what's interesting is Nishida wants to say is that that's not what's going on here, right? Because he says that repetition is not production. So in a way, that would be another possible tension point, is that this constant return to the present. In Hegel's view, that was how he would understand the nature and the developments in nature, but maybe Nishida has an alternative way of saying this. And I thought in this one, I floated the proposal that we could understand that in the sense of the eternal now. So the way that the transformation principle, this absolute contradictory self-identity, is present despite this contradiction in transformation, right? This becoming not oneself by transcending oneself. And maybe in that sense, it allows him to break from this kind of static repetition of nature picture and allow for the process of creation and production. Yeah, that might be one point to engage them, but I think there's a real problem there.
Other questions, comments?
So I'm coming from.
Can you?
Oh, sorry.
The people on Zoom cannot see us.
Right.
Comparative literature and got into comparative philosophy, so I'm mostly interested in issues of language. So I'm very excited to hear about the translation. But specifically in this case, as a reader of Hegel, I like the early Hegel, and I have this sort of vague conceptuality of Hegel's whole work as a kind of crusty hardening. So inside, both Hegel and Nishida, right, are building their own language as a kind of Grenzsprache in Wittgenstein terms, in order to talk about something that is just sort of beyond the reach of what we can talk about up to now, kind of thing. Would be my general description of what they're doing in their shared problematic in using language and having a necessity to use words that are established in new ways. So we learn to read Hegel by reading Hegel, at least in German. In English, there's already hardened sort of yoga and vocabulary, specialized vocabulary. And for example, if you say sublation for Aufhebung, then I think if you think about Aufhebung in German, there's this polyvalence of setting something on a higher shelf, which is also a metaphor used in chemistry, and bridge building in chemistry were really hot at the time. But everybody was talking about this kind of thing and how you conserve energy by putting something in a suspension state, speaking. So these words are very polysemantic, and that sort of gets lost sometimes when it's translated into English, right? So both Nishida and they're creating a sort of hardened specialist language of their own, but at the same time conserving a kind of working So that I think, I don't know, that would be my impression. So I guess my question there, how do you? No, first question, would you agree that maybe Hegel's own hardening in his practice, language teaching, maybe not language, I mean philosophy teaching, he had to make a system, that was the day of system philosophy.
Right.
But did he do that in a way that inside of that, the language could keep on working? And would that be a Nishida way of reading Hegel?
Ah, that's interesting. Yeah. I think there are a few interesting examples in Hegel of that. So maybe the most famous one is just this notion of speculative identity, right? So when he says that X is truly Y, for example, he doesn't actually mean that they're the same thing, right? Instead, you're supposed to understand it in this complex framework of how the sources of meaning are related to one another. So that's a good example of where he's using, or he has to use the kind of grammatical form of a judgment, X is Y, but he tries to put it and explain it in an entirely new and complicated way that continues to be controversial to this day. So yeah, you see him kind of stuck with the kind of grammar of his language, but yeah, trying to redevelop it in an interesting way. And
I would say it's like a repurposing of the propositional statement.
yeah, absolutely. To a complete reappropriation of the propositional statement, so that many of the the philosophers of the 19th century just thought he was talking in riddles, right? Because there was a missing of what was actually supposed to be going on with that speculative identity.
But that's exactly what Chinese philosophy does with statements, right? Make a paradoxical statement.
Sure, yeah. And then maybe I think with Nishida himself. I mean, of course, this was a time when, especially with Nishida, where the linguistic terminology for doing academic philosophy was kind of being pounded and refashioned, right? Novel translations for terms had to be rethought, had to be disseminated, had to actually gain currency, right? So there's a kind of an interesting problem there where the whole reshaping of the vocabulary to deal with issues and actually communicate with one another in these issues. So that's certainly, I think, a big part of, especially for Nishida's generation, of what was going on. That's right. Finding new possibilities in ancient terms or creating neologisms that could capture a point in a novel way.
Is there any reflection of the linguistic or like a meaning making in Nishida, sort of looking for like the exact
with linguistics itself?
Well, how does meaning happen? I guess like as an example of mutual action or something like that. That's how I imagine it. Process philosophy, but
I mean that was kind of the framework of the presentation I wanted to take today. Is like, how does meaning happen, right? Sorry, I was kind of irresponsibly using my own kind of dense, heavy, and fixed and rigid philosophical terminology. But this point of ontological truth, we can say that is the question of how does meaning happen? How does something become intelligible? And so I think Nishida's response to that question in this article is this concrete logic of absolute contradictory self-identity. And there's no way to state what that means economically, unfortunately, because Nishida wants it to do so many things at once. Maybe part of the issue in trying to talk about it in such a compact way today is that it takes a bit of time to digest exactly how all those parts are moving together. But maybe I think one of the key takeaways is just how important life, and maybe this is another issue that goes back to Goethe's question about life and morphology as transformations, right? And that meaning is possible in the sustaining and transforming of life.
That's interesting. this kind of linguistic problems. For example, I don't know if you agree, but I think that between Hegel and Nishida, there is also a big linguistic problem. And Nishida, for example, criticized Hegel, saying that what is problematic in his dialectic is that it's based on the subject of the sentence. So it's not only ontological, but is shugotekibu, so is being that is on the side of the subject of a sentence. On the contrary, Nishida's dialectics is jutsugodeki. It is based on the predication, not on the predicate, but the activity of predication. That is self-determination of a universe, of a predicate that envelopes the subject. And I wonder if the problem is really linguistic, because why? So because Hegel thinks and writes in German, so in a kind of in European language where you have always a structure, subject, popular, predicate. And Nishida is thinking Japanese. It is a completely different kind of language where the subject is not so important. What is important is the predication, predicate activities. So it's the difference, I think, according to Nishida, if you think dialectically in Japanese or in German. And the Nishida's view is if you think dialectically in German, you cannot escape to create an ontology, because subject, since Aristotle's logic, subject is the first substance. So it's impossible, even for Hegel, who tried in all the ways to make himself free from kind of substance. Seen from the standpoint of Nishida, it was not completely successful. Why? Maybe because there is a basic difference in languages that they are using for them to think dialectically.
Yeah, I think.
What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's if we sort of expand the issue out from sort of a maybe just the grammar or structure of Japanese, and think of it in terms of the history, right, of thinking, this sort of the path dependence that these the way that language is used and the way that it can be reused and still be intelligible, right? I think then you would have to conclude that the issues in how to say something are tied up with what you have to say, right? And so then, as I was mentioning earlier for Hegel, he attempted with this notion of speculative truth, I think, to try to avoid some of the problems that Nishida charged him of. The question, of course, of whether he was successful or not, and we could have a good debate about that. So, for example, Tanabe thought that Nishida was being unfair, and that really Hegel did understand that it's not just subject or predicate, but it's the copula of the middle that was crucial. So there could be a debate about, whether or not Hegel was successful. I mean, using speculative identity to basically retransform the way the grammar works, right? But the question is that, like you said, it's because it's writing in that language and it has its history of, speaking and exchanging words and making oneself communicable in that way, that he had to face that specific problem. Right? So maybe in Japanese, then those issues could be circumvented in a different way. And that's, I think, something that we have to keep in mind. Maybe, but I think it can go both ways, though. So I'm a bit resistant in saying, idealizing any language and saying, German is the only philosophical language, or even Japanese is the best philosophical language. I think they both will carry their own historical baggage, right? Their own historical tensions and problems. And I think, it's definitely a worthy place to be looking for how thinking is unfolding. There's good questions there for sure.
Because And then I give Lorenzo the last question, then we have to move to Steve. But because for Nishida, according to this whole text, first comes bodily experience contradiction. And only from that bodily experience, then you, historically situated with your own language, you can try to make a philosophy of it if you want, to conceptualize this bodily experience. For example, Nishida writes, for sure, the young Hegel, the Hegel of the time of the life of Jesus, or he had this bodily experience of a deep self-contradiction. And from there, he could develop in German his own thought. Nishida probably say, I made the same, but in Japanese. And it's not the same. But sorry,
Can you sorry, just before, that's why I was thinking it was on the slide 29. He used the example of me in the center. Maybe
right.
Can you think of a better example than putting me or the I in the center, like, because it really felt that you're saying that Nishida's philosophy, he's talking from a first person perspective and to say that the subject is the center.
Yes.
So I
yes,
think
yes.
maybe that example wasn't.
yes, and
right.
So that was meant as a bad example, right? That was the yeah. That was meant as an example to be refuted. Yeah, I agree.
John, her question and Rico's comment, so like something as you were talking, something in Nishida, talking about Nishida style. I mean, he
yes.
famously not the most beautiful Japanese prose, but something that always struck me as kind of interesting, and I haven't seen it widely in other Japanese philosophers from the same age. The fact is, so often comes to, so he's not, his way of predicating is often not is. It's not this or the other, but so very often and that's first, if you're talking about style, this is such a, I think there's so many of the things that you were like this constellation of meaning, because it's so first of all, of course, it's not inventing the grammatical form, but it's a double negation. So it's a very Hegelian way of affirming something.
Interesting.
And of course, in English it's must, so it's modal logic. But in Japanese, it's not just the necessity. When it says, well, the word must be historic, it's not just saying, oh, it is so necessary. For me, I mean, as far as I understand that, when it's writing, otherwise I would say the word is historic. If I'm saying the word must be historic, it means like I'm trying to dynamically, I'm thinking the word as historic as kind of like a Aufgabe. So it's something that like must, not in terms of like it must be, it is necessarily so.
Yeah, very good.
But it must be creatively thought as historic. So like I find these double negation, the sense of tension, and so on. That's maybe hard to translate. Enrico is the one who's doing maybe the most translation among us. So I'm wondering how your data essay.
yes, it is.
It has to be.
But I agree with you. So another point is that Nishida doesn't create a system, a philosophical system in this stage of his, but he's writing simply essays. So it must be so, and I make an experiment to see if it's really so or not. And then he continues to write and write and write.
So must is really something that must, which in Japanese is more interesting because of this double negative character. It really sense, I think, because it's like for us it's easy to take it as like a logical necessity, but I would say no, it's way more emotional or like necessity.
This task type issue, the demonic issue, desire.
That thing, I mean, cannot but yes,
I cannot
like the thought things itself.
I agree with you.
That's like among the many issues with this style. I mean, this one kind of pops out, and I think it anticipates so much in the form of his writing. So many of the meanings you're exploring are already there.
Yeah. I think that's good. Sure.
Kobayashi Toshiaki writes a lot about that. Kinyona Buntai also mentions that Nishida says himself he was almost embarrassed about his lack of skill in the standard. That his education fell just before the introduction of the Dearu style, as it wasn't completely firm yet.
Right.
So I don't know, but it could be that stating something like they are as a kind of maybe imported way of making propositional statements was something that he was not comfortable with. I don't know. I mean, that's my intuition.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. I think, yeah, there's another, yeah, that issue, right? I think that when he calls that absolute objectivism, so the way that I understood that was that in thinking of worlds, right, it must be thought this way, right? So it's, you have to, because it's imposing this task on me to, think and produce.
The thinking is imposing itself.
Well, that's, I think, yeah, exactly.
If I'm not a subjectivist, I mean,
Right.
if I'm starting from the predicate,
Right.
then the predicate has the priorities, but the force, the energy is in the predicate.
Yeah.
And using the kind of like, again, double negative masculine means a way of shifting the it's a verb that like really kind of in translation it becomes being. Must be, I mean, but I think it's a bit different. I mean, one would need to collect examples and think.
No, sorry.
Sorry. Steve also prepared a presentation.
Well, but we have to finish at 6, so we might as well just continue.
We can go.
No, we have it.
Because I made a reservation at the restaurant 6:45, and we can
we
manage to arrive there
we're
for
supposed to
7.
finishing at 6, I think, so.
It's okay at 6:30.
Then we go by cars.
You don't have 2 cars today, so.
Yes, we can have any time to.
Unless you don't want to present, right? Unless you don't want to present.
Well, I just don't like, okay, are we taking a break or are we starting?
No break. No break. So thank you very much.
This, it must be this, because it's not the way around, so. Because.
Okay.
Okay, well, hello. Am I supposed to introduce myself as well?
Yes. Maybe it's.
Okay, so for anyone who doesn't know, my name is Steve Lofts. I'm the Roche Chair this year, which I've been very grateful to have received and provide me opportunity to just work. And thank you, Enrico, for the invitation, both to be the Roche Chair, but also to participate here. I don't consider myself a Nishida scholar by any stretch of the imagination. I'm struggling to be a scholar in Japanese philosophy or learn Japanese philosophy. As you all know, I consider myself a graduate student, and some days I just feel like an undergraduate. Philosophy takes time to sink in. And when you enter into a new tradition in another language, another culture, another historical context, situation, it takes even longer at my age for that to sink in. And I've been consuming, as I think some of you know, Japanese philosophy extensively for the last 5 years. Some people say I'm obsessed. Maybe I am. But I've gotten to the point where I can't consume anymore. I need to digest it. And I had a talk today on absolute contradictory self-identity, which would take the absolute and use it as a non-relational contradictory self-identity, go into the ontological structure, point out that this text is in fact a rereading of Hegel's philosophy of right, and then argue that this is Nishida's statement about his social political theory based on a Buddhist reading of Hegel. And I was going to put all these quotes in and show how this worked. And I just got this impression that I was going to tell you things that you already all know better than I do. And it wasn't on my project. I came to Japan this year to do our current project, and I had to get back to it. And so I will just take this opportunity to talk about my project. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to how I want to read Nishida. And the context I think that Nishida needs to be read in. So I'm changing the focus quite a bit. So as I think you all know, I interpret the Kyoto school from the perspective of a philosophy of culture, where the of in philosophy of culture is a double genitive. This means that it is at once a philosophy of culture that deals with the factum of culture, what is culture, but it is always already a philosophy of a particular culture. That is to say, the facticity of culture, its historical life, coming to understand itself as it posits the universal. This philosophy of culture I see as uniting two antithetical horizons that operated in European thought, to which I do know a little bit about. The one is the neo-Kantian transcendental philosophy, and specifically the Marburg school is what I'm interested in. Cohen, Natwerp, and Kassir. And Itabashi has already shown quite convincingly the importance of Cohen to Nishida's thought. I would add Natwerp, and I would also add Kassir's substance and function. The neo-Kantian transcendental philosophy of the Marburg school is given a logic of intelligibility, a logic of signification. The other horizon that's operating is the Lebensphilosophy of Bergson and the hermeneutics of life and existentialism of Heidegger, which of course are contradictions. The Lebensphilosophy is precisely a critique of transcendental philosophy, as is the hermeneutics of life and as is the existentialism. The two should never meet. I spent years trying to bring them together, the square circle. Now, beyond the scientism of Cohen, the official scientism of Cohen, there's Kassir and Natwerp push transcendental philosophy to its very limit and arguably beyond it. They begin from the transcendence of the idea and attempt to descend to the Hegelian ladder into the self-illumination of concrete life. Natwerp in particular sought to return to the creative origins of poiesis at the root of the idea. The symbolic forms are the cultural mechanisms of world forming. They are the mediums of signification. And so the philosophy of symbolic forms is a morphology of spirit developed out of his reading of Goethe. Kassir was one of the great Goethe scholars, could quote most of Goethe by memory. Bergson and Heidegger, on the other hand, begin from the self-illumination of life and sought to climb the Hegelian ladder to the essential structure of the idea, from the existential finitude of Dasein to the Sinn von Sein. And we have to remember that being in time is not complete, that the part we have is only the Dasein analytic. From there, Heidegger wants to wrestle a concept of time to understand the sense of time as such. And when he does so, according to Kassir, he must pass through the symbolic forms. He must use language. The tension between life and logic ended up in a split. At the beginning of the 20th century, there is a tension between life and logic. And this tension becomes split at around 1929, according to most intellectual historians. I'm speaking here of Friedman and Gordon and Levinas, all identify 1929 as the moment when the tension between life and spirit, or life and logic, split into an analytic tradition that goes with Carnap into North America, and the life tradition that continues to foster into the continental school. And since then, the great continental divide has been unbridgeable. I would argue that analytic tradition and continental tradition have exhausted themselves, and that philosophy is now in crisis and must return to its roots. That is to say, where you were the logic or the connection between life and logic. For Kassir, the advocates of life and concrete existence, Bergson and Heidegger, still speak the language of spirit. The idea of life is the idea of life and not life itself. And beginning from the immediacy of life and concrete existence that negates the idea, they have no access to the transpersonal domain of objective signification, and therefore no access to life or existence in the end. Heidegger wants to ground the Weltverständnis, the intelligibility of the world, on a Seinverständnis. And he wants to ground Seinverständnis, the intelligibility of being, on the intelligibility of time. Kassir's point is that the Seinverständnis and Beingverständnis are always already part of the world. They are already a world intelligibility. This, of course, undermines the whole project of being in time. And one could then ask whether the later Heidegger tries to move out of this. There must be, Kassir insists, already within life an immediate tendency towards idea, a Zug zu Idee. So the idea that life somehow pulls itself out like a train, it pulling itself out into an idea. Life must give itself form, for it is through the otherness of form that concrete life and existence gain its visibility, if not its reality. For Kassir, and he says this in the context of a reading of Hegel, for whom he says the young Hegel has a robust theory of life and therefore should not be understood as logocentric. The project is to reconcile the immanence of life, the Allein Vital, the finitude of Dasein, with the transcendence of the idea. All seeing, sehen, and all visibility of phenomena, Sichtbarkeit, takes place through the sight of spirit, Sicht. We are always already in the symbolic. We are always already in language, in technology, in aesthetic forms, in a mythos. We are always already in meaning. Every act modifies, however, that symbolic framework. Life is a life in meaning for Kassir. The symbolic is at once the medium of signification and the means of expression by which we form the medium of signification. So the symbolic function is prior to the metaphysical dualism of the subject-object and is prior to the metaphysical dualism between sense and sensibility. Symbolic pregnance is a middle point between the Husserlian categorical intuition of ideationality and Heidegger's analysis of existence. It is a originary relationship, a Urverhaltenis, that is so fundamental, but it can only be understood in terms of duality, but is not itself a duality. It is a non-dual duality of sense and sensibility, being and validity, etc. The separation of matter and form, as in Husserl, is a confusion of the transcendental distinction with an ontological distinction that does not exist. The symbolic forms, or symbolic function, is modeled after the mathematical functional relation that from group theory. So this is the move in 1910 between substance concepts to function concepts in mathematics. That Cassirer is then going to generalize and say this is just one application of the function. And you have a linguistic function, a sensible function, etc. So the mathematical function relations is the model for the other symbolic forms, and it comes from the idea of group theory. It at once differentiates and integrates the elements, the universal and the particular. The image consciousness effaces the paradoxical opposition between presentation, Gewahrtechung, and representation, on which Husserl's entire theory of perception is based, and therefore also modern philosophy is based. So the paradox of representation. Every content of consciousness is a representation, and every representation requires a content of consciousness. And this before Derrida is precisely Derrida's critique of Husserl. We have no direct access, for Cassirer, we have no direct access to the immediate activity, the Werken, of the life of consciousness. Therefore, we must constantly, for Cassirer and Natorp, engage in a reconstructive structure. We must start from the product of Werken, the Werklichkeit, and reconstruct the activity of the Werken. But this dialectical process of moving, of reconstruction, ends up being a moving from the forma formata, the form formed, to the forma formas, the form forming. That is to say, from the created to the creating. So for Cassirer, we are constantly searching our unity and creating it as we move. And this is what Heidegger is going to critique. He's going to throw out Dasein as what provides the unity, but Cassirer is going to say, no, that's just a new type of monism. That's the problem. The symbolic overcomes the opposition between the immanence and transcendence. It's the unity of the one in the other in the one. These are all quotes. It is a dialectical unity, a coexistence of contraries, a unity of opposites. The symbolic is an immanence and transcendence in one, insofar as a fundamental superintuitive content is expressed in an intuitive aesthetic form. It is the decisive achievement of every symbolic form that the rigid boundary between the inner and the outer, the subjective and the objective, does not subsist as such, but is brought into definition. Inner does not stand alongside the outer, and the outer alongside the inner, as if each were its own separate precinct. Rather, both are reflected in the other. And only in this receptacle reflection does each disclose its own content and constitute its own form. The key term that when I translated Cassirer, the philosophy of symbolic forms, was the word Auseinandersetzung, which means a confrontation or an opposition. And in Japanese, it would be tairisu, which is exactly the same word that Nishida uses. And in fact, they're interchangeable with Auseinandersetzung. But the problem with Auseinandersetzung, what Cassirer wants is auseinander means separate or asunder. And Setzung means deposit asunder. Auseinander means out of one another. And so the oppositions do not exist prior to the symbolic framework that differentiates and integrates. It is the differentiation and integration all at once. It's Auseinandersetzung is also the term that Heidegger uses for authentic Dasein. Dasein has an Auseinandersetzung with Nicht-Dasein. And it is this process of the opposition that sets out the two simultaneously. For Heidegger, however, Cassirer's philosophy has no access to the concrete. It has therefore no term for Dasein. Now, this doesn't mean that Heidegger rejects Cassirer. What he says is, and I quote, everything is correct, right down to the essential. But it is not an essential account. What Heidegger means is that why Cassirer has given us the framework of creativity is it's not itself a creative act. It needs to be grounded in an analytic of Dasein. If you read Being and Time, I am prepared to show over 50 explicit references to Cassirer's work, where Heidegger is grounding Cassirer's work in his own existential. One example, well, myth all the way through, but language. Reda is not language. It is the existential condition of a theory of language as a symbolic form, right there in the text. The only people saying language as a symbolic form is Cassirer in 1929. For Heidegger, every seeing and understanding of the givenness of the world is grounded in the hermeneutical as, or what means the same, Dasein's vision or sight, Sicht. The visibility, Heidegger says, Sichtlichkeit of the world, the openness of the world, is grounded in the vision, Sicht, of Dasein's finitude. That is to say, Dasein's transcending itself towards its Nicht-Dasein. Dasein's authentic existence, as I've already said, is the Auseinandersetzung with its own negation. The referential totality of signification of the average everydayness levels down the concreteness of Dasein to the general, the conditioned normative Das Man. Now here we have in this idea of everydayness an interesting issue. For Cassirer, that everyday is not the average everydayness of the Das Man. It is the transpersonal structure. For Heidegger, everydayness is the average, the normative leveling down. In Nishida and Japanese philosophy, the everydayness is the expression of the eternal now. These are three different conceptions of the everydayness. The debate between Cassirer and Heidegger, and more importantly, between the two hermeneutical horizons that their respective philosophies give expression, namely the factum of life and the facticity of life, is the logical conclusion of a rupture between thinking and being inaugurated by modern philosophy and brought to full expression in Kant. With Kant, the project of special metaphysics, that is to say, the rational account of the actuality of God, the world, and the soul, where the factum and the facticity meet, is brought to an end. We can no longer talk about what we cannot experience. Debate between Cassirer and Heidegger concerns the nature of philosophy then. What is the nature of philosophy? For Heidegger, Cassirer has recoiled like Kant from the facticity of the human. For Cassirer, Heidegger has abandoned himself to thrownness and given up an active agency in the world. In both cases, it is a return to Kant. A return to Kant that is also a return to and beyond Hegel. Now, the Kyoto School. In 1915, in Thinking and Experience, Nishida argues that the historical task of contemporary philosophy, so not the historical task of Nishida philosophy, but of all philosophy, is founded in establishing, quote, the synthesis of these two modes of thinking, referring to transcendental philosophy and Lebensphilosophy. This marks a return to the project of special metaphysics, though not in its dogmatic form. This is repeatedly stated by Nishida, Tanabe, Nakai, Miki, Kuki, and Nishitani. The return to understanding God, world, and self is found in all of these authors. It is the central project. 2, this work, this marks a return to Kant. It goes beyond Kant and involves a rethinking of German idealism as a post-Kantian metaphysics. This, too, I would argue, is repeatedly stated in all these authors of the Kyoto School. Granted, while we cannot talk about what we cannot experience, Thank you, Kant. This does not mean that there is not an experience of which we cannot speak, but which is the source of all speaking. In different ways, each of the Kyoto School thinkers is engaged in this project of making manifest and thematizing the fundamental experience that is prior to the dichotomy of modern philosophy, an experience of the unity of life and logic, factum and facticity, the noumenal and the phenomenon. And this involves a rethinking of the schema and the productive imagination, which involves the synthesis of the two modes of thinking, the two hermeneutical horizons of Cassirer and Heidegger, that we expressed in the standpoints of Cassirer and Heidegger, respectively. The synthesis of the factum and the facticity, the idea of the world and the idea of the world and the life or existence, the abstract logic and the concrete logic. Now, some timelines. The debate between Cassirer and Heidegger dates back as early as 1923, when Cassirer invites Heidegger to give a paper when Heidegger is not even on the horizon yet. And Cassirer has already recognized him as one of the greats and started a dialogue. In 1925, Cassirer brings out the second volume of Philosophy of Symbolic Forms. This is a crucial year in the writing of Being and Time. It's when Heidegger moves from the Dilthey edition of Being and Time, where life is the structure, right? So away from the hermeneutics of life to the existential reading. It happens in 1925. In 1925, he's under great pressure to actually finish Being and Time and move on. And he will then eventually just do that. About 60% of the book Being and Time that we have was already written. That means 40% of that book was written in a whirlwind writing space within 2 months. In 1925, Heidegger stops what he's doing to read the Philosophy of Symbolic Forms and spends a great deal of time to write amazing, one of the best reviews ever written about this book, in which he says Cassirer's philosophy is good, but it needs to be grounded in an analytic of Dasein. If you turn then to Being in Time, you find in the opening when he says, what I'm not doing psychology, I'm not doing history, I'm not doing this. He has a whole section talking about primitive Dasein and the importance of the study of primitive Dasein for the understanding of average everydayness. And then if you look at the footnote, it's Cassirer. And if you go to the seminars in that period, he is constantly talking about Cassirer in his seminars. In 1929, they meet in Davos. The only reason that Heidegger accepted this was because he was told that Cassirer would meet him. Otherwise, he had already rejected the invitation to come to Davos. And they said, no, Cassirer is going to be there. And he said, okay, then I'll come. The event is quite dramatic. The Davos debate took place 2 weeks after a major scandal in the newspaper, anti-Semitic thing where the National Socialists said that the scandal of Germany, the crisis in Germany was that Jews were telling us how to read Kant. And they specifically mentioned Cohen and Cassirer. This was published in every newspaper in the country. This was the background to the debate in 1929 between Cassirer and Heidegger. If you listen to the debate, Heidegger goes after Cohen for his official scientism, which Cassirer had already moved beyond. But because it was of the context, he had no choice but to defend Cohen. So if you look at the debate protocol, you see them coming close, then you see them going away, coming close, going away. There's no shortage of evidence that said that both of these individuals were trying to come closer together. Just the historical context forces them away. So the Davos debate takes place in 1929. I have seen the protocols. There were 2 Japanese thinkers there, but they are unnamed. and I have yet to hunt them down. I've been going through and eliminating people. I keep asking people, so when did this person come back? When did Cookie actually leave? Well, he was 1929. I want the day. And so I know there are two Japanese participants. They're named, they're not named, but they're talked about. They ask questions, etc. Heidegger's Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics is also published in 1929, and Cassir's Critique shortly thereafter. Now, there is no point in returning to Kant to determine whether Cassir's reading or Heidegger's reading are correct. First, because Heidegger himself, in the preface to the second edition, said, Kant doesn't say any of this. I just made this shit up. I call it hermeneutical violence. And so he just admits it, right? So there's no point of going back. The problem is not there in what Kant actually says. The problem is how you can read the productive imagination from these two very different perspectives, from the two fundamental standpoints of the factum or of signification or the facticity of being. Okay, back to the Kyoto school. My thesis here is that the debate between Heidegger and Cassir is the background for the entire Kyoto school, which is just, might as well throw it out there as a polemical debate structure very quickly. And I can only, sketch this out. Nakai, as you all know, he's my hero. Nakai, 1927, writes on the preface of Kant's Critique of Judgment, in which he looks at the role of the imagination and its connection with what Kant calls in the preface to the third critique, the technique of nature. During the 30s, Nakai develops this into a theory of poiesis and techne as the and establishes himself as a synthesis of Cassir and Heidegger explicitly. So he's explicitly situating himself between Cassir and Heidegger. He's taking the functionality of the transcendental form and the historical facticity of existence, and he's trying to fuse them. Nakai is often called the Walter Benjamin of Japan. For both, human existence is formed, configured, and organized by different historical forms of material, technological, and discursive mediation that are transformed through history as history. The work of art, therefore, is the essential medium and means of worlding. Nakai understands technology as a poetic and dialectical mediation between the human and nature. Quote, this human purposeful action sways nothingness into being and being into nothingness in order to combine them into the human sequential order in the schematic axis of the natural sequence. The mediating moment that sways being into nothingness into being and being into nothingness is the structure of the logic of technology. It's the logic of the imagination. End quote. In this way, the human, as one of the powers of nature, confronts material nature by means of the natural power in his body or her body, as well as by means of the active force of the intellectual work. The human works on nature, and in doing so transforms nature, therefore simultaneously transforming his own nature at the same time. This is a quote from Nakai. Nakai's philosophy seeks to establish an aesthetic mechanism that mediates and embodies the collective will to see in an originary phenomena of the creative activity, art as poiesis and techne, at work in the work of art that opens the world. Now, Cookie. In 1929, Cookie writes Bergson and Heidegger, and at the core of this article is a reading of Heidegger's reading of Kant and a critique that is very close to what Cassir will do. Not quite Cassir, but close. And Cookie is clearly trying to navigate between a traditional reading of the productive imagination and Heidegger's explicitly. This becomes fundamental to his idea, his own philosophy of aesthetics and his own philosophy of what the words?
Contingency.
Contingency. Thank you very much. Now, I move on to Mickey. In the early 30s, Mickey started a work titled Philosophical Anthropology, which he abandons in 1937, and to work on the logic of the imagination. In both works, Mickey situates himself again between Cassirer and Heidegger. The logic of the imagination is the logic of symbols, Mickey writes. Symbols refer to the fact that the inner and outer are one. It is not that the interior exists separate from the exterior, nor that the exterior exists apart from the interior. Symbols attain where inner and outer is inner. This is very close to the quote that I gave you from Cassirer. In Mickey, quote, a true symbol is not a symbol of something, be it a being or thought. The essence of the symbol is to symbolize without something symbolized. Again, Cassirer would agree. Cassirer writes, the symbol hastens ahead of reality, showing it the way and initially clearing its path. It does not merely look back on this reality as being and become, but is itself an element and motif of its becoming itself. It reaches forward into the to come, Kunft, and outward into the sheer possibility by placing both before itself in a purely symbolic act. Now, what is this sheer possibility? Sheer possibility in the Western tradition is an oxymoron. All possibility is always the possibility of an actuality. The movement for Aristotle is always the actualization of a possibility in an actuality. The only thing that is pure in the Western canon is pure act, whether it be the act of the demiurge, whether it be the act of the one, whether it be the act of God. These are pure act. Pure matter is a fiction. There is only, in a certain sense, heat. Cold is a privation of heat. Matter is seen, pure matter would be considered a privation. Evil is a privation. So there is always, possibility is always inscribed within a type of actuality. It is always the possibility of an actuality that can be actualized or realized in some way, shape, or form. The idea of sheer possibility would be a possibility that has no form. This is what Tibetan Buddhism calls sunnata, pure possibility, the possibility without form. Let's move on to Tanabe. In 1931, Tanabe writes Synthesis and Transcendence and the Standpoint of Anthropology. And I must confess, Tanabe has hurt my head trying to read it. I just can't enter into his Japanese. I'm sorry. There are limits. Anyway, in Synthesis and Transcendence, 1931, in The Standpoint of Anthropology, 1931, Tanabe develops his understanding of transcendence as a movement in the direction of the infinite that surpasses the finite existence through a critique of Heidegger's concept of the imagination, or Heidegger's interpretation of Kant and the imagination. And in form, time, from time schema to world schema, 1932, Tanabe works out his conception of the world schema again through a critique of Heidegger's interpretation of Kant. And in The Logic of Species and the World Schema, 1935, Tanabe finally establishes the relation between logic and life in the context of his earlier readings of Heidegger's interpretation of Kant, which he's critical of, but not dismissive of. Logic is the logic of life, and the self-awareness of life is that of logic. Tanabe's critique of Heidegger clearly echoes that of Kessier. One cannot resolve the symbolic without referring back into the faculty of the productive power of the imagination, Kessier says to Heidegger at Davos. The power of the imagination, he reminds Heidegger, is the connection of all thought to intuition. Kant calls the power of intuition the synthesis specioso, so the specific. The synthesis is the basic power of pure thinking. For Kant, however, pure thinking, does not depend simply on the synthesis, but depends instead primarily upon the synthesis that serves as the specific, the species. But this problem of the species or specific leads into the core concept of the image, the concept of the symbol. And this is Kessier reminding Heidegger that his what's wrong with his interpretation and why it's limiting to it. But it's one that leads right into Tanabe's own reading of it, and it sets up for the world schema, which then sets up for the logic of the specific or the logic of the species. Finally, central to Nishitani's philosophy, we find the problem of the productive imagination. And here, too, we find Nishida developing his understanding of the imagination with explicit reference to the debate between Kessier and Heidegger. There's a passage where Nishitani has now laid out what he means by mythical imagination, and then immediately from nowhere says, yes, but of course, this is not exactly what Kessier is doing. And he gives Heidegger's critique of Kessier. But at the same time, in another place, he's critiquing Heidegger, and it's clear that this is a critique that Kessier could have made. In 1941, the relationship between politics and religion becomes the central issue for Nishitani, and the response to this is to rejoin them, is to re-enter into the mythical imagination, the thinking through images that joins the political, that is to say, the realm of signification, with the religious, that is to say, the realm of sunnata, emptiness. And I would argue then that in 1948, when Nishitani turns in his studies in Aristotle to an analysis of the imagination, he's doing background check. He's doing a background research because he wants to get further into the imagination. But the problem of the imagination is already central in 1941, and I think earlier, but I can't get back into those texts yet. My instinct is it is. And therefore, in 1985, in Kyoto Soku, when he turns to talk about the imagination, this is not descending from a transformation of Nishitani's thought. This is the project right from the beginning. So Nishitani's entire project is how to understand the productive imagination in the schema. Now, let me be clear. While the thinkers of the Kyoto school read Kessier and Heidegger, it is not their philosophical works per se that are important here. I am not arguing for some type of influence or determination. Rather, it is the antithetical hermeneutical horizons that were expressed by the standpoint of Kessier and Heidegger. The antithetical standpoint of life and logic that the Kyoto school sought to reconcile by way of a return to a more primordial standpoint. And this reconciliation of life and logic is the primordial and originary experience involves a return to Kant and an interpretation of the schema and the productive imagination. And that this is what unifies the Kyoto school. And that this return to Kant and rethinking of special metaphysics in a non-dogmatic way, a form that is able to unify otherwise antithetical domains of the idea and life defined Kyoto School. Now to return to Nishida, since I was supposed to speak about Nishida and I haven't said yet, I don't have a word about him. The power of Nishida philosophy for me derives from the fact that it is in constant motion. From pure experience to active intuition in the historical world of poiesis, Nishida's thinking is always in movement, always transcending itself in a creative act. It is always to be in becoming and never to be. He situates himself in an alchemic moment in the eternal now, between an infinite past that no longer is and an infinite future that has yet to take form. And he not only thematizes this creative moment, but participates in it. Nishida thus moves from creative moment to creative moment, always to be in becoming and never to be. The danger of speaking about Nishida philosophy is that we reify this dynamic creative movement into something called Nishida philosophy. That said, there are, I believe, 5 constant points of reference in Nishida's work, though the movement is his relation to these 5 points changes over time. The 5 moments are Kant is central from the beginning to end. Hegel is beginning from beginning to end. Buddhism is there from beginning to end. Mathematics is there from beginning to end. And his engagement with interlocutors, the most important aspect, is what drives Nishida forward, constantly being creative, responding. The project, however, is constant. In 1915, he has established it to reconcile the antithetical modes of thinking, of life and logic. Transcendental philosophy, logic, and Lebensphilosophy, life. In the inquiry, it's called thought and intuition. In the 1939 text, it's abstract logic and concrete logic, or the historical world and absolute nothingness. Beginning in the early 30s, specifically 1933 with the fundamental problems of philosophy, 6 things happen. 1, Nishida's philosophy turns to society, culture, and history. 2, he begins to bring out the dialectical nature of his theory of Bachot, which will eventually culminate in the absolute contradictory self-identity of 1939. 3, he develops his concepts of the historical world and active intuition as poiesis, which I read as a return to Kant's imagination. 4, he distances himself from Hegel, ultimately breaking from him. In the 1930s, Japanese ultranationalism is in the rise. By 1936, it's almost impossible to have public protests. It is a nasty little period of time. I find it curious that Nishida now distances himself from what is largely seen as the architect of modern fashionism, this is, say, Hegel. And in 1939, he provides a reading of Hegel's philosophy of right, which is the sociopolitical theory of freedom and history in Hegel, culminating in a state, but a rereading based on his Buddhism. And it's also interesting that as he moves from 1933 up to 1939, the Buddhist background of his reading becomes more and more explicit to the point where later he will just simply say, I am the opposite of Hegel, I'm a Buddhist. 5, he makes explicit the Buddhist dimension of his thinking, which I just said. 6, he introduces the productive imagination, or at least a certain reading of it, into his thinking under the terms active intuition as poiesis and technology. For Nishida, the historical world is the product of mutual determination or formation, literally the becoming a form of the self in the world. Nishida's terminus technicus for this mutual determination is active intuition as the knowledge as action that marks a dialectical movement from something made to something making. The historical world is creative, self-forming, moving from form to form. And the self is a creative element of the creative world. As the place of poiesis, that is, the place of the active intuition, the human being constitutes the historical presence. The form of living things is functional. Word function figures prominently in the Nishida at this time. To say that things, that living things act functionally is to say that they have form. Technology is the transformative mechanism of the creative mediation between the self and the world, the human and nature. Technology is the union of us and nature. And our historical body, therefore, can be understood in light of the machine, end quote. For Nishida, human beings are the homo faber. We are born in a historical society and technically make things. And by making things, we make ourselves. In fact, historical reality itself is technical. The form that forms itself is called the historical specific. And it plays a subjective role in the historical world. Form is not a static form that is separate from existence. Form, as contradictory self-identity of the one and the many, has reality. Last quote. Action intuition is the self-determination of the eternal now. In action intuition, which I read as imagination, the self and the world are united in an absolute present, where the past and the future are contained within the immediacy of the moment. This is not a static unity, but a dynamic creative process in which the self and the world mutually determine each other. That's it.
Thank you very much. Yes, we can think about 15 minutes of discussion, then we have to run to the restaurant.
I'm happy just to run.
So, of course, as always, also the people on Zoom, if you want to question and during discussion, just do it without raise your hands or.
Okay, let's go ahead.
Can I?
Yes.
Yeah, I kind of really liked how it all brought us to this intention that was slipped in there at the end, this idea of active intuition as the imagination. And I think you've set this, incredible development of the lay of the land, right? And what was one of the key theoretical issues of the time, and the way that it comes back to this problem of the function of the imagination in this supreme value invested in creativity, right, and novelty production. And so, I wonder if you could just unpack that a little bit more with how you understand active intuition as imagination. If we have this kind of going back to Kant, to go beyond Kant in a certain way, we also have to rethink this issue of the faculties that Kant was thinking of, these faculties of desire, faculties of judgment, faculties of wish. And if we think of active intuition in terms of the power of imagination, what would that imply in this, sort of confrontation with Kant?
In terms of the Heideggerian critique is that Kant, steps back from the consequence of the imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And the consequence is precisely that there would be nothing to limit the imagination. The imagination could create its own categories. So its own ideationality would be a product of imagination. is essentially what Heidegger is saying. And Kassir will say, yes, but it's not just temporal, it's also spatial. And this sort of, he wants to integrate the two. But in terms of Kant, it depends on how you want to read Kant. There are three critiques. And Kassir is very clear. It's the third critique is the center of the system and not the first critique. And generally we read Kant from the first critique and we look at the imagination as it functions within the first critique. But Kassir's point was that no, the center of Kant's whole philosophy is in the third critique. And that when he pulls back from this idea of the technology of nature, which comes out of the unpublished preface to the third critique, the reason he does this is because he wants to leave the human something special, I guess. And there, I think, is a critique. I think Kant does pull back.
Can I just quickly add to this? The imagination, I think the word is slightly misleading. It's this Einbildungskraft, you know? So it's kosoric, in Japanese. It's much more embodied, robust than visual or imagining something. Yes. So it's like doing things in real world through your body to create. Yeah. So and then action intuition is really about now you do things and that already shows your understanding, right? So you already do things and that actually embodies what you sort of structurally in symbolic terms that already expresses your
imagination through the act of
So but maybe the imagination is but we don't have any better English word.
No, and that's true. And I think this is where Kassir is pulling it out into the symbolic forms, which are very material action things. And so all of these are parts of the way the imagination is functioning. And the imagination projects into this sheer possibility and creates.
And then what's the creativity, right? I mean, it's not just in your head.
No, it's doing that's creative. So Kassir will say things like, no speech act doesn't change language. That every single individual, the second they speak only by working on language and creating language. And when they create, they change the whole framework.
Oh, so it's in that sense, not it's action. It
is action intuition. And we in creating the form then creates us. So we're at once assujettés by the structure, and yet we're the subjects of the structure. And we constantly are moving from the form to the formed forma to the form forming.
So that's why the cultural material world symbols becomes embodied in this whole thing, and we can't not do it.
Yes.
That's
exactly.
That's absolutely right. In English, there's just imagination, but like this sense of imagining as something like already Husserl is saying, in Einbildung Kraft is a word born out of a completely wrong model or like Vorstellung. So like already, you went through Heidegger, in my understanding at least, at least possible revolution of the sense of imagination is already in the end. The unpublished manuscripts on imagination by Husserl are like feel more radical, but already when he's saying that the center is on the table, like he's part of the world as a different mode of consciousness. And that imagination is the mode of phenomenology. So he's understanding that in a more radical way, and then it doesn't really go anywhere because it's like too much like focus on the eidetic, but he's recognizing that both the epoche and ideation, and then the idea of phenomenology itself takes imagination as its like ground method. And it's something that in a way, like not even Heidegger is like doing anything with, even though he's criticizing Kant, but then there's no again, there isn't much symbolism, there isn't like a free theory of imagination in Heidegger, like not as a phenomenological function. But again, you went, so it's an incredible, it's a whole landscape. So like I need a week maybe.
We have a comment. Christopher Isherwood. He had to leave. Probably is not no more connected, but he said, well, I don't know if I can read. Thanks for the presentation. Many ideas reminded me of David Bohm's implicate explicate order and the need to approach these classical ideas, Western and Japanese, with a new language, Bohm called the Rio mode. Anyway, thanks again. I don't know. My English was correct, probably not, but
I mean, obviously the devils are in the details. But again, I've been consuming so much stuff I needed to regurgitate. I needed to digest and regurgitate. But I have to step back and see, can I start putting this together? What's my overall framework? And the argument is that the philosophy of culture as a double genitive is always a facticity that's trying to understand itself. It's a self-awakening of culture. There's a self-actualizing, self-understanding, to speak with Nishida. And that this goes through the imagination, is productive of the form that it is itself. And so when the culture speaks about culture, it is a concept of culture. It's a concept that belongs to a specific awakening of an event. And I want to take these events as seriously as unique. And argue that, you know, this is how these events of worlding happen. And what's we were talking about this today. This is why I'm sort of want to keep the idea of a worldly world would be an idea of culture that becomes the self-actualization and realization of an existential facticity of event. And if we have a hope of not destroying ourselves, it is only if we can start to have the idea of this worldly world. And so this project is, you know, I spend a lot of time wondering, why am I doing this? Why are we talking about Nishida? Why are we talking about any of this stuff when I look out the window and I think, this is like, we're going down the toilet so fast, it's amazing. We're destroying the planet, we're destroying each other, you know, we've isolated and insulated ourselves from each other. And when I want to say, what's the source of this? I keep coming back to Kant. Kant is a nihilist who puts up this barrier that I can only ever have the phenomenal presence, I can never get to the noumenal. And this means I cannot speak about God and however you want to envision that. The world is historical time and the radical finitude of the self. What I see in Nishida is an amazing attempt to say that the religious, and not religion, religion is a historical institution belonging to a historical world. But the religious is this movement that exits the world and then comes back. It exits the logic of contradictory self-identity, the historical world, confronts Außeneinsetzung, this sheer possibility, sheer emptiness. This is the imagination facing the sublime. And I was saying this today. I've been reading a lot about Nishida, but I haven't found yet anyone who said, oh, and what is, Kant's got this idea of the sublime. Maybe this could be useful here. Because it's exactly that movement out into the noumenal that dogmatic theology or special theology, special metaphysics was trying to do. Theology, I think we understand theology as a sort of intellectual domain, and when really it is at once a philosophical attempt to understand what is revealed in faith. And the importance of faith in Nishitani, in Mickey, in Nishida, that idea of faith is somehow a primordial experience that must be nurtured and articulated. And it's the articulating of this, whether it be the faith of the eternal now, or the faith of however you want to understand this faith. This is what reason has to articulate in creating its world, imagine it and form it.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I think this time. Thank you also to the participants via Zoom. The next seminar will be April 15, and the topic will be Nishida and Chinese thought, in particular Wang Yanmin thought. We'll see you next time.